Welcome to Biden Brief. The content of the briefing includes: Biden holds calls with Israel's Netanyahu, Palestinians Abbas. Israel vows complete victory over Hamas as Gaza crisis deepens. As Israel readies invasion, charter plane carrying reservists heads to Tel Aviv. U.S. seeks to lead on Israel, Ukraine. House Republicans still mired in chaos. Iranian oil faces scrutiny amid Israel-Hamas conflict. Biden holds calls with Israel's Netanyahu, Palestinians Abbas. Reuters. U.S. President Joe Biden has expressed continued support for Israel and the need for humanitarian aid for Palestinians in calls with leaders from both sides. In a call with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, Biden offered support for urgent humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people, particularly in Gaza. He also discussed efforts to prevent the conflict from escalating and the need to preserve stability in the region. In a call with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Biden reiterated unwavering U.S. support for Israel and warned against broadening the conflict. The calls took place as Israel prepared for a ground assault in Gaza. Israel vows complete victory over Hamas as Gaza crisis deepens. Washington Post. Israel has stated that it is preparing for a ground invasion of Gaza, as it continues its military campaign against Hamas. Israel's national security chief, Tzachi Hanegbi, stated that Israel could no longer accept Hamas as a sovereign entity in the Gaza Strip, and that a complete victory was the only possible outcome of the battle. The Israeli military is said to be preparing a wide range of offensive operative plans for Gaza. Meanwhile, aid groups and diplomats are trying to relieve the escalating humanitarian crisis in Gaza, with efforts focused on convincing Israel to rescind an evacuation order in northern Gaza, or to at least pause its bombing campaign to allow for aid deliveries. However, there is no sign that these efforts are having any effect. The health ministry in Gaza has stated that 2,215 Palestinians have been killed since the start of the Israeli military campaign on October 7, with almost 1 million people having been displaced in the past week. The UN has warned that more than 2 million people are at risk as water supplies run out. As Israel readies invasion, charter plane carrying reservists heads to Tel Aviv. Bloomberg. Israeli and American cryptocurrency venture capitalists, David Malka and Jordan Fried, have chartered a plane to transport Israeli Defense Force reservists, stranded Israelis and American Jews from Los Angeles to Tel Aviv. The charter flight was organized due to flights being canceled by major airlines in and out of Tel Aviv because of the conflict between Israel and Hamas. The charter flight also carried supplies such as Kevlar vests and fleece sweatshirts, funded by Malka and Fried, who hope that donations will offset some of their costs. U.S. seeks to lead on Israel, Ukraine. House Republicans still mired in chaos. Washington Post. The United States is facing a perilous future as it heads into an election year, with the country wrestling with its own demons and caught up in internal divisions and infighting. According to a Washington Post op-ed by columnist E.J. Dionne Jr., he contrasts President Joe Biden's pledge of unwavering U.S. support for Israel in the wake of the recent attacks on civilians with the ongoing chaos in Congress as Republican lawmakers struggle to elect a speaker. Dionne argues that the Republicans' inability to govern reflects the toxic legacy of former President Donald Trump and his hard-right policies, while Biden's resolute stance on Israel exemplifies the kind of U.S. leadership that is expected around the world. However, Dionne warns that the deep divisions in the U.S. and lack of seriousness among Republicans in Congress could be undermining the country's reputation and ability to meet global expectations. He also highlights the potential for further disruption if Trump were to win the 2024 election, given his America First rhetoric and erratic behavior. Dionne concludes that the forthcoming election is crucial for setting the country's direction and restoring confidence in U.S. leadership, both domestically and internationally. Iranian oil faces scrutiny amid Israel-Hamas conflict. Yahoo! Iranian oil has become a topic of debate among Republicans, who are calling on President Biden to block sales of Iranian crude. The country is a member of OPEC and the fifth largest crude oil producer in the group, producing around 2.4 million barrels per day in 2021. Its oil exports bring in around $40 billion in net oil export revenues annually. Republican politicians have blamed the Biden administration for allowing Iran to sell oil, although experts suggest there is little evidence that U.S. sanctions enforcement is the main driver of increased Iranian oil production and exports. Wood Mackenzie's Anne-Louise Hittel said that reduced demand for oil during the pandemic had contributed to an increase in Iranian exports, as countries including China bought discounted crude. Ben Cahill of the Center for Strategic and International Studies said that when prices rise, sanctions enforcement tends to weaken. Biden administration officials have insisted that they are enforcing sanctions on Iranian oil, and have not ruled out further action. This is genocide. Al Jazeera. The ongoing conflict in Gaza is not just an onslaught, invasion, or war, it is a genocide, according to an opinion piece by Hamid Dabashi in Al Jazeera. Dabashi argues that the Israeli government, with the support of Western governments, has been engaged in a long-term project of incremental genocide against the people of Gaza. He accuses Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet of wanting to erase Gaza entirely. Dabashi also criticizes the media for its biased coverage of the conflict, arguing that it portrays Israelis as innocent victims and Palestinians as guilty perpetrators. He argues that the international community, including the International Criminal Court, has been complicit in the genocide by failing to hold Israel accountable. However, he also expresses hope that the Palestinian people will persevere and rebuild despite the ongoing horrors they face. The views expressed in the article are the author's own, and do not necessarily reflect those of Al Jazeera. Antony Blinken urges Beijing to use influence in Israel-Gaza conflict. South China Morning Post. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has urged China to use its influence in the Middle East to prevent other actors from attacking Israel and escalating the conflict with Hamas. Blinken made the plea during a phone call with China's Foreign Affairs Minister Wang Yi. The U.S. has expressed concern about the possibility of Hezbollah, an Iran-backed militia group in Lebanon, joining the conflict. China has close relations with Iran and recently helped to broker a diplomatic détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Wang reiterated China's opposition to actions that harm civilians and its support for political solutions. Confusion reigns for U.S. citizens in Gaza as border stays closed. The Independent. A group of Americans attempting to leave Gaza were left stranded at the Egypt border after a misunderstanding between the U.S. and Egypt. Israel had issued warnings for residents in the northern part of Gaza to evacuate as it prepared for a ground push into the region. The Biden administration advised American citizens in Gaza that the Rafah border crossing between Gaza and Egypt would be open to them. However, when Americans arrived at the border crossing, they were turned away. It is unclear why Egyptian authorities refused to allow U.S. citizens passage. The border remained closed by 5 p.m. local time, and it is uncertain if it ever opened for Americans to cross. The U.S. State Department has yet to provide an explanation for what happened. Israel latest, Hamas says 9 more hostages killed by bombs. Yahoo! An unnamed U.S. official has said that American citizens in Gaza may be allowed to leave the Strip on Saturday. Israel and Egypt have said that the individuals can exit through the Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt, but it remains unclear if Hamas will agree to this. There is also no word on whether other foreigners will be allowed to leave Gaza. In another development, Hamas has said that a further 9 hostages, including for foreigners, have been killed by Israeli bombing. Israel is widely expected to launch a major ground invasion of Gaza as part of its attempt to eradicate Hamas from the region. So far, Israel has killed over 1,900 Palestinians in airstrikes, whilst Hamas has killed 1,300 Israelis in an incursion into southern Israel. Great Reads, Israel's Many Woes, Canada's Critical Minerals Challenge, and How AI Affects What We Eat. The Globe and Mail. In this week's selection of great reads from the Globe, Yossi Klein Halavai writes about the difficult options facing Israel in its war against Hamas. Neil McGee discusses why Australia seems to be benefiting more from Canada's critical minerals sector, and Adrian Morrow explores the factors weighing on the U.S. as it becomes more involved in the Israel-Hamas conflict. Other articles include A Night in the Life of Ukraine's Voluntary Defense Unit, the use of AI in the food industry, and Zadie Smith's new historical novel. Hunter Biden investigations lead to ethical concerns about President Biden, an AP-NORC poll shows. The Toronto Star. A recent poll conducted by the Associated Press NORC Center for Public Affairs Research found that 35% of U.S. adults believe President Joe Biden has done something illegal, while 33% think he has acted unethically but not illegally. Only 30% of respondents believed Biden did nothing wrong. The poll reflects a deep political divide and widespread skepticism about the morality of government leaders. Republicans have launched an impeachment inquiry into Biden, seeking to tie him to the foreign business dealings of his son, Hunter Biden. However, no evidence has emerged to prove that Biden himself abused his role or accepted bribes. The survey findings highlight the deep cynicism and suspicion within the U.S. political system, with respondents largely judging Biden based on their partisan affiliations rather than the facts. Roughly two-thirds of Republicans believe Biden is guilty of crimes pertaining to his son, while only 8% of Democrats and 38% of independents agree. The poll also revealed a sense of corruption within the federal government among respondents, with many believing that politicians neglect the country's needs due to greed and corruption. The poll also found that more U.S. adults trust Democrats over Republicans to handle corruption in government, although many do not see corruption as a strong suit for either party. Biden's overall job approval has remained low, with 4 in 10 approving of his handling of the presidency and 61% disapproving. However, Biden earns higher marks for his handling of the coronavirus pandemic, 52% approve, compared to his handling of the economy, 32% approve. Despite criticisms, some voters believe Biden displays his values by standing with workers and not with corporations. Left's take on Hamas stuns American Jews and threatens Democratic split. Financial Times. The Times reports today that the U.S. Democratic Party is in danger of being torn apart by the rise of the hard left. The paper says that this group is often anti-Israel and is often accused of being anti-Semitic. It cites an example of this when the New York City chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America held a rally in Times Square to celebrate the Palestinian resistance to Israel. Campus groups have also joined in, with 34 student groups at Harvard blaming Israel for the violence inflicted on its people, and at California State University Long Beach, one student group advertised a protest for Palestine, with a poster featuring a paraglider of the sort that Hamas gunmen used to attack Israelis. "I never would have expected this kind of vitriol among educated elites," one Jewish software executive from Washington, D.C. suburbia said. "And now I just can't unsee it." The paper concludes that this is likely to become a major issue in America's next presidential election. Watch, Joe Biden trips upstairs ahead of speech. Telegraph. Joe Biden stumbled while walking upstairs during a visit to Philadelphia, raising concerns about his fitness for office. The 80-year-old president has had several stumbling incidents since taking office, leading to questions about his physical health. In September, it was reported that Biden has been wearing tennis shoes and undergoing physiotherapy to prevent falls. His age has become a concern for his re-election campaign, and there are fears that another stumble could shatter his hopes for the 2024 election. A poll found that 73% of Americans, including two-thirds of Democrats, think Biden is too old to run again. Biden has been diagnosed with spinal arthritis and foot arthritis. U.S. and Europe clash over Trump-era tariffs. Wall Street Journal. Negotiations between the U.S. and the EU over metals tariffs are not expected to be concluded before next week's summit in Washington, and may not be settled until after the next U.S. presidential election. The tariffs were imposed by Donald Trump in 2018, and the Biden administration is keen to resolve the issue as part of its efforts to reset relations between the U.S. and the EU. The EU is seeking a definitive end to the tariffs and compliance with World Trade Organization rules. The U.S. wants the EU to impose tariffs on steel from China, which it believes contributes to global overcapacity and undercuts U.S. producers. It is reluctant to end its tariffs on European metals, instead seeking EU commitments to impose levies on Chinese steel. The EU may need to accept a U.S. condition that the tariffs will not be permanently scrapped until after the U.S. presidential election, which EU member states fear could lead to their reintroduction. Republican chaos and indecision as crises shake the world. The Guardian. Republicans in the U.S. are struggling to elect a Speaker of the House of Representatives to replace the ousted Kevin McCarthy. This is causing a 10-day paralysis in Washington, which could have far-reaching implications as the international community becomes increasingly concerned about the lack of U.S. leadership on a range of issues, including the Middle East, Ukraine, and the climate crisis. The Republican Party is currently consumed with a bogus impeachment inquiry into President Biden and publicity-seeking antics of members such as Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Nancy Mace. Robin V. Sears, the slippery slide from democracy to fascism. The Toronto Star. The recent anti-Semitic threats to Jewish organizations in Canada following the violence in Israel and the occupied territories should serve as a warning about the dangers of right-wing populism. Canadian author Jason Bell's new book, Breaking the Nazi Code, highlights how quickly societies can slide into extremism. The book tells the story of Winthrop Bell, a Canadian war hero who played a crucial role in shaping history, and warned about the dangers of poverty, bitterness, and distrust leading to right-wing populism, extreme nationalism, racism, and a disgust with democracy. It is a reminder that Canada is not immune to these risks. Israeli military reports significant movement after telling Gaza residents to flee as conflict enters week 2. CBC. The Israeli military has ordered 1 million Gaza residents to evacuate as it prepares for a ground offensive, according to the latest reports. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has also promised further retaliation for Hamas's attack last week. Israel has imposed a total siege on the Hamas-run Gaza Strip, home to 2.3 million Palestinians, and has launched unprecedented airstrikes. The military has conducted temporary raids into Gaza to battle militants and search for the 150 people who were abducted during Hamas's assault on southern Israel on October 7. The United Nations called on Israel to reverse the evacuation order, while Hamas urged people to stay in their homes. The Palestinian Health Ministry reported that at least 2,269 Palestinians have been killed and 9,814 others wounded due to Israeli attacks in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The death toll included 2,215 from Gaza with 8,714 injured. The other 54 dead and 1,100 wounded were from the West Bank, according to the report. Zelensky and Dutch PM visit Odessa and agree to boost air defense. The Independent. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte have pledged to strengthen Ukraine's air defenses and increase the security of a humanitarian corridor for grain exports. Zelensky stated that Ukraine is working to enhance its position in the Black Sea to continue vital grain exports and ensure budget revenues. The Odessa region, where Zelensky and Rutte visited a damaged port, has faced frequent attacks from Russia. Meanwhile, Russian and Ukrainian forces are engaged in fierce battles in Avdiivka, a strategically important town in eastern Ukraine. The fighting has been ongoing for 4 days, and Russian forces are reportedly suffering significant losses. In another development, a Ukrainian intelligence source claimed that Ukraine had struck 2 Russian vessels in separate attacks involving seaborne drones carrying experimental weapons. The source did not provide details on the damage caused. The attacks allegedly took place on Friday and Wednesday and were carried out by the Ukrainian Security Service and naval forces. The reports have not been independently verified by Reuters. The situation in Ukraine remains tense as Russian forces continue their offensive in Avdiivka. The Ukrainian military has been holding its ground and repelling Russian attacks, but the fighting has intensified. The increased violence has prompted concerns from the international community, with the White House stating that it is running out of runway to support both Ukraine and Israel. Additionally, the U.S. expressed confidence that the Ukrainian military would be able to repel the Russian forces. Ignoring U.S. calls for peace, Egypt delivered drones to Sudan's military. Wall Street Journal. Egypt has supplied drones to the Sudanese military to aid its fight against the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, a militia led by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo. The delivery of Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drones last month is the latest example of regional powers becoming involved in Sudan's civil war, which threatens to widen the conflict and undermine efforts by the U.S., the UN and others to mediate a ceasefire. The RSF has responded to the drone attacks with artillery shelling and obstructing food and medical supplies to the military's strongholds. Has support for Ukraine peaked? Some fear so. New York Times. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky visited NATO defense ministers in Brussels this week to express concern that the conflict between Israel and Hamas will divert attention and support from Ukraine's ongoing battle against the Russian invasion. NATO pledged an additional $2 billion in immediate military aid to Ukraine. However, there is a sense that support for Ukraine will never be as high as it was a few months ago. The concern extends to the U.S. Republican Party, where cutting support for Ukraine is seen as a litmus test of conservative credibility. The bipartisan support for Ukraine in the U.S. is no longer guaranteed. European officials openly admit that Europe cannot fill the gap if Washington cuts aid to Ukraine. The European Union's head of foreign affairs and security policy acknowledges that Europe cannot replace the United States, and warns, without Western aid, Ukraine could not survive more than a week. European leaders pledged to send air defense systems to Ukraine to defend against a possible new Russian air campaign, but European promises to supply 1 million artillery shells to Ukraine by March are falling short. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is struggling to win voters over to his call for a stronger military, and a far-right opposing Ukraine's war effort has surged in Germany. Well folks, that's all the news for today. As always, we covered a wide range of topics, from the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas to the political chaos in the United States. It's a lot to take in, but don't worry, I'm here to break it down for you. First, let's talk about the situation in Israel and Gaza. President Biden has expressed support for both Israel and the Palestinians, emphasizing the need for humanitarian aid and efforts to prevent the conflict from escalating. Israel, on the other hand, is preparing for a ground invasion of Gaza and has vowed to achieve a complete victory over Hamas. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza is worsening, with millions at risk as water supplies run out. In other news, we have a group of American citizens stranded at the Egypt border due to a misunderstanding between the U.S. and Egypt. The U.S. State Department has yet to provide an explanation for what happened, but it's a frustrating situation for those involved. On a lighter note, Israeli and American venture capitalists have chartered a plane to transport stranded Israelis and American Jews from Los Angeles to Tel Aviv. They even brought supplies like Kevlar vests and sweatshirts. Talk about going above and beyond. Now, let's shift our focus to the political landscape. The U.S. is facing internal divisions and infighting, with Republicans struggling to elect a House Speaker and Democrats facing criticism for their stance on the Israel-Hamas conflict. The upcoming election will be crucial for setting the country's direction and restoring confidence in U.S. leadership. Speaking of leadership, there are concerns about President Biden's fitness for office, as he has had several stumbling incidents and is facing questions about his physical health. While these incidents may raise eyebrows, it's important to remember that age should not be the sole factor in judging someone's ability to lead. Finally, we discussed the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the concerns that support for the country may be waning. Ukraine's President Zelensky visited NATO defense ministers to express his concerns, as the conflict between Israel and Hamas threatens to divert attention and support. It's a delicate situation, and the international community must continue to stand with Ukraine. Well, that's a wrap for today's news. I hope I was able to provide some clarity, and maybe even a few laughs along the way. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts and answer any questions you may have. So, what are you waiting for? Let's get the discussion started. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, You have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6do Brief via email.